Hey, are you trying to get more out of your networking? Do you feel like you're going to event after event and not making any traction for your business? Well, it could be that you're approaching networking in all the wrong ways, which is why I'm so excited to have Adam Marx back on the show today. He's the 0 to 1 networker, and he is an incredible person who understands what does it really mean to network, and more importantly, beyond just growing your business, what does it mean to grow actual, real relationships? We talk about it on today's podcast episode in this follow-up interview. Check out this quick ad before we dive into today's episode, and we'll be right back soon. By the way, don't forget, if you want to support the podcast, you can always check out our Patreon, patreon.com/goodadvice. Having said that, we'll be back soon. Do you ever feel like your payment processor is robbing you blind? For some of us, it's not blind. We look at the amount of money that's going to our payment processor month after month, and a lot of times we ask ourselves, is there a better way? I'm making good money, yet so much of it isn't actually ending up in my pocket. In the world of payment processing, in many cases, it's a cashless world, so you have to have a payment processor you can really trust. I personally am a big fan of Brad Norwood, who's the owner of PrimePaymentsUSA.com. Brad's a business owner himself. He knows all the challenges that come with running a business. More importantly, he knows the value of an individual customer. See, some of these bigger businesses, they're all about scale. They're all about bringing in as many customers as possible. But do they know your name? Do they know your business? Do they know what's important to you? In many cases, the answer is no. And in worst cases, they're just looking to get as much money from every transaction that you work hard for, which really doesn't feel too good. So you got to reach out to Brad Norwood today and understand how he's doing business and why it can save you money month after month. More importantly, you might even ask him about his zero-fee payment processing that he's offering to a select few of people. Go to PrimePaymentsUSA.com and start putting the money that you worked hard for back into your pocket. Adam, we're back for a round 2 conversation. Thanks for, I guess you didn't suffer too much on the first conversation because you were willing to come back a second time. Thank you for making the time today.
Or I have a high tolerance.
I have the way I describe inviting guests on my podcast is I always have to lead with an apology because I have like a very low tolerance for guests on the show. And low tolerance isn't the right word. I have a low standard, I guess, for like, oh yeah, sure, come on the podcast. But then when I say that, I'm like, oh geez, I just communicated to the person that, I just let anybody on here. But I am very casual I love getting just people on the show. I love meeting people like yourself and having people on the podcast. But more importantly, I love having guests back on the podcast. So I'm excited to continue our conversation today. How you been, man?
Good, busy. The last time we spoke was it like February or March of
Oh my gosh. Was it that
2024?
far away?
It was,
Wow.
it was right before I did South by Southwest last year.
Oh my gosh. That's
And
wild.
I know, I don't know where the year went. I mean, there was
Well, it's because the podcast interviews get posted typically a few months after.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm sure that episode probably went up in the summertime. This one we're fast tracking. This was going to go up in the next week or so.
Yeah.
But wow, it's crazy how relationships, I feel like we talk all the time and that you were just on, but I think you're right. That blows my mind to think about.
Well, I mean, I think that goes to the point that I consistently tell people, that relationship building is really methodical. It's really
Mm.
about patience. And, so, before we kind of dive into that, for any of the listeners who maybe didn't hear the first podcast or aren't familiar, I'll take just a minute to just introduce myself. So they don't think it's just some schmo on your podcast. Ones are like, who's this guy?
Who's this guy?
So my name is Adam Marx. I am the 0 to 1 networker, which is also the name of my company. The guy on LinkedIn with the orange sunglasses, which we talked about, we could talk more about. I'm here in Atlanta, and I specialize in network building, relationship building, long-term development, and I work with a lot of startups and larger corporate organizations helping them really scale and maintain their access and their relationship strategy so
Yeah.
that it complements their sales strategy, their marketing strategy, and all those cylinders are kind of firing in unison. Um, and I sit on the steering committee for InnovATL here in Atlanta. I co-host LinkedIn Local ATL here in Atlanta, and you can usually find me running around the city doing a variety of things, and I just kind of pop up at events. So that's just kind of like a broad overview. So it's not just like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, it's just some guy to fill the
I've
airspace.
definitely, unfortunately, this goes hand in hand with my joke earlier about the quality of guests. I definitely, in the early days of Good Advice, there was definitely a guest or two where, like, in hindsight, I was like, who was that person? Because there was an age of like hyper growth of the podcast and like guests coming on where I'd have like 3 or 4 guests a day.
Hmm.
And definitely there were people who I was like, I don't even know who that person was. That was weird. But not the case for our dear friend Adam. Adam, I nowadays for guests on the show, typically the people I ask on are people who they have an insight on business that I think is just very interesting or intriguing. I don't always necessarily agree with it, but I think it's very intriguing. And then there's people who come on the show where I find myself continuously aligned with the way they do business, which would be the case for you. You know, you and I have kept in touch since you came on last year. I know you spoke at South by Southwest last year. You're speaking at South by Southwest this year. I love the way you do business. I love your values as a business person, and this concept of networking. I think is something we talked about it a little bit in the first meeting, in our first
Hmm.
conversation, but I feel like more and more this is something that is very difficult. Like you use the word methodical, that I think is a very
Hmm.
powerful word for a business owner to think about. I feel like a lot of people, maybe this is a good starting point. I feel like a lot of people see networking as this is the sales event that I'm going to, or this is the sales conversation I'm going to. And I maybe told you this story, but I went to like a networking event early on in my business. A guy walked up to me, handed me his business card, walked away, didn't say a word, just handed it
Right,
like I walked in the
right.
handed the card. He went to the next person, handed the card, and I was like, "What just happened? That was so bizarre." But he was like in business card mode, right?
And I remember that conversation, which your listeners can kind of go back and find out on the first episode we did, because I remember talking about how that is what I call showering someone with business cards, like as a strategy.
Yeah.
And it's one of those strategies that, although I use the word strategy kind of loosely there, I mean, it's something that we have kind of just learned how to do as a society. And it's something we should be unlearning. It's not a
Mm,
great strategy. It doesn't work. When I say that, sometimes there's a little bit of pushback because the perception is uh, don't do business or don't do sales or just kind of network just for the sake of networking, and like that's not really where I'm coming at it from. What I'm really trying to get people to understand is you do the best business with the people with whom you form the longest relationships,
mm,
and those relationships are built on mutual benefit, they're built on trust, they're built on these things that like they just don't happen in like a 2-hour period. And
mm,
like I'll be the first one to say, like, I spend my most of my time when I'm working and in professional mode going to events or in networking mode, and most networking events kind of suck. I mean, and
yeah,
that is just because as a group, as a society, we've been kind of conditioned to approach them in a really transactional way,
yeah,
as opposed to going and looking for like a great conversation. If you go to a networking event and you have one or two really good conversations with someone, whether it's about business or not, that is a win.
mm,
You are walking away with a win. It doesn't matter if you're talking about the product that you're putting out, or the Braves game you were at, or the other club that you're in, or like you happen to meet someone, and you just kind of talk about books or movies. Like it doesn't matter, because what you're doing is you're really forming the basis for a further dialogue. Okay. And what I really want people to understand is when you are in networking mode and building a network, you are not in the mindset of exclusively building a customer base.
Mm,
Some of those people may be customers, they may be partners, they may be collaborators or investors or whatever it is, but it's a network.
mm.
And sometimes it's a support network. So, business is not always up and to the right. I think any business owner will understand that and acknowledge that. And my dad always says like everything is easy when it's easy. Like when things are going great, like it's great.
Yeah.
It's when things are not so easy or when you're kind of going through some tough moments where having a network of people,
Yeah.
not just a customer base, is really valuable because that's where you glean that support and you glean that um, people throw when I say throwing you opportunities, I mean being able to say, "Hey, let me make an introduction,"
Mm.
or "Let me see what I can do to help," or "Let's collaborate on something." I mean, that is methodical.
Well, and
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 you know,
well, and I think about from like a sales perspective. I mean, sales is hard for everyone in the sense of like I don't I think there's a select few that sales comes naturally, but time and again, I think about like my consulting customers, we always end up coming back to sales because people are thinking about revenue, how to grow the business, what have you. And I just think about how easy the sale is when it comes from someone you've built trust with who says, "Hey,
mhm,
I want to introduce you to someone. Hey, this person needs some help." And I just feel like the speed of the deal is so much faster. Like, there's so much less vetting that happens in the sense of like, yeah, the word of mouth is strong enough. And it almost it just makes the process so much easier when you've built that network. But on the same token, it feels like a lot of people have a really hard time with seeing the long-term value. I don't I guess
mhm.
maybe the value maybe that's the wrong way to put it. Maybe it's an element of patience. I don't really know because I do go to a lot of networking events where there are people and I understand it. You know, there's people probably listening today who are like, "Yeah, I want to play the long game, but I have to pay my rent Friday." You know, who are like, "I got to pay my bills."
Right.
So like I understand that tension a little bit. But definitely what you're talking about is we're talking about long-term success rather than making a quick buck.
Well well, I mean, and that's the thing is people may hear this in the context of a dichotomy, right? Like, do
Yeah,
this instead of that,
yeah.
right?
Oh,
And
I
and
love
that's
that you
just
say
kind of
that. Sorry, go
that's the
ahead.
kind of how we were, good guys, bad guys, and
Yeah,
and
mhm.
good decisions, bad decisions, and the reality is that life is a lot more complex than that.
Yes.
And so it bumps up into a strategy I have called revolving irons, and I give really funny names to every kind of strategy. So if anyone wants to, make little notations,
See, this
uh,
way here's the deal, though. There's so much content stealing that happens on, like, LinkedIn and what have you. When I love that you're doing this, though, because when this pops up on, like, another person's feed, you could hang on a second. I know where that came from because that's such an out there this is the strategy of the eighth monkey is what I call it, and then you see some influencer posting
yeah,
about it, and
right.
you're like, "Wait a second, that's clearly my strategy." But anyway, I
Well,
digress. Go
I
ahead.
mean, the thing about it is like, look, there are a couple of things that people need to understand, and I kind of was sharing this, after our podcast recording last year. I was speaking at Atlanta Tech Week. This is some stuff I shared with them, and I've done stuff really throughout the end of 2024. But there are some concepts that I think will really benefit your audience, and so I'll mix a few in and I'll explain all of them. So one of them was this revolving irons, which I'll talk about. One of them is what I call Schrodinger's email. Okay, and so these all kind of mix together. So I'll explain them in reverse. So Schrodinger's email is this kind of for anyone who's familiar with the science, the thought experiments of Schrodinger's cat, right? And I mean, you don't really know until you open the box and see if the cat is poisoned or not poisoned. So it can be thought of as dead or alive at the same time. And for any psychologists and scientists out there, please don't check my math on that. Um, I'm not coming for your job, I promise.
Yeah, yeah.
But but I will say that it's the same. Like when you send out an email or you send out a follow up or you send out a message or whatever it is, okay, there is a tendency to obsess. I mean, I hate to say that word,
Hmm.
but it is probably the most accurate word for that feeling, because it becomes, oh gosh, a week has passed, 2 weeks have passed,
Mm,
3 weeks have passed. Why haven't I heard back from this person, that person, this person? And like, you have got to learn to chill out.
yeah.
And I know that that's hard. Like, I'm not always the best person at taking my own advice. You can ask my girlfriend. She's really like, hey, look, you need to chill and recognize that when you are building networks, you are dealing inherently with a set of data that you don't have. And what I mean by that is, you don't know what's going on the other end of that phone, the other end of that email chain. You
Yeah.
just don't. And there is a tendency to take things personally.
Yep.
Oh, she didn't get back to me. He hasn't gotten back to me.
They hate
Waiting for
me.
the deal to go
Yeah.
through.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
thinking they don't want to do the deal. Like,
Yeah.
all of which is your brain trying to figure out a way to decipher a black box of data that you know exists, but you don't know what that data is.
Yeah.
And that is the most frustrating thing. It's especially frustrating for people who are in sales and people who are in looking at metrics and looking at like the data, the funnel, and all that kind of stuff. Where it's like, that is a very linear way of breaking down um, ideas and content, and that's why it's good for what it's good for. When you are talking about people, you don't know if someone's kid is sick, you
Yep.
don't know if they're going through family stuff, you just don't know.
Yeah.
And so this bumps up into the revolving irons concept, which is, you know sending 4 emails, that's overkill. Okay, you
Yeah.
are going to negotiate yourself, forget out of a deal, you'll negotiate yourself out of a relationship,
That's right.
and that is a problem. The best thing you can do is to say, okay, you know what? I don't know what's going on in her life or his life right now. And I can't seem desperate. I can't project that. Even if you
Right.
have a bill to pay, you can't project it. And I'm in startups. So like, I know what it is to scrape by. Okay.
Yep.
I'm not criticizing anyone.
Right.
Best thing you can do is say, well, what is within your control?
That's right.
You can turn that attention, which is negative right now because you're obsessing, you're feeling skittish, all very normal feelings, but it's a negative kind of energy. And you can turn that to something more positive and say, okay, while that is gestating and marinating, I'm going to take that energy and re up that conversation, re
That's
up
right.
that conversation. And
That's right.
so, what you are doing is you are continually building your network. That's the momentum.
Hmm.
And yeah, it's hard. But I think that anyone in business will. I don't know any kind of business, frankly, where it's like very linear up and to the right, where it's just like there's growth every 2 weeks, and that's
It
just the reality,
it
and
depends
we'll just
on
keep growing into oblivion.
it depends on who you're following on social media. Because for some people, that's the story, and you're like, I don't know about that. I don't know about that.
Right? Okay,
But
for some people, but
yeah,
like
but
also
no, you're right.
some people
Yeah.
win the lottery. Like, it does happen,
Or
right?
well, they say they
Someone
do.
is going to
Right.
win the lottery.
True. True. Yes. I mean, I think about I had a buddy of mine who he quit his 9 to 5 to start his business, and he was like, "So what do I need to know?" And I was like, "It's going to be tough, man. Just know it's going to be tough." And like he was a web developer. And like day 5, he calls me and he's like, "Dude, I just signed the band Switchfoot." And I was like, what?" And he was like, "Yeah, like friend of a friend of a friend somehow, and now I'm handling like all of their web development."
But
And I'm like,
right, but that even that experience, an example, that wasn't
"Yes.
linear.
Yes.
That's not linear. Okay, it's not like he built pages and
Right.
then they built pages for companies that were a little bigger. Like, and I'm not criticizing. That's
Yeah.
in effect what I'm trying to get people to understand is like,
Yeah.
you don't know what's going to come down the road, and because of that, you can maximize your potential by just having lots of conversations.
Well, and
And this is
it's
why it's different than sales.
well, and
It
even that story is an example, like friend of a friend, he built
right,
the network that made starting the business very easy, which a lot of people I
right.
feel like they build the network out of the pain of the struggle of business. It's not the question
Almost
is
ups it's
exactly right. I was
well,
gonna say it's not cart before the horse, but you're right. It's backwards. It's like the wrong. It's not understanding the process that we do this.
It's not understanding the fact that we use sales metrics to assess the growth and progress of networks, people networks, and it's an inaccurate
Mm,
assessment because we're using the wrong metrics.
yeah.
When you are using those kinds of sales metrics, I mean, think about like the metrics that someone who is in sales can use to assess the growth of their product, service, whatever, right? They're looking at, click-through rates, download rates,
Yeah.
follower count, billable hours, number of widgets sold. Like these are all very quantifiable things, and that's why they work for assessing the growth in that manner. When you're talking about people and relationships and things that are just kind of like come out of nowhere and relationships that seem dead in the water, and then, oh, suddenly you got a text message like
Mm,
11 months later,
yeah.
those are really not good metrics to use to assess accuracy. A better metric, even though it drives people out of their mind, the better metric is to say, okay, do I have more access to people than I did 8 months ago,
Mm,
today than I did 8 months ago? And like that is a better metric because what it allows you to do is look through the lens of time and patience, which is really hard. It's especially hard to do in the startup world where it's like, hey man, ship yesterday, done is better than perfect. Like these are all wonderful things that they sound so good in a tweet or like in a post. And like there's an element of truth to that. But like you can't automate your way into building a great network.
mhm.
I know that I'm going to get pushback. There's as well. What about AI? What about this? And I have my own conversations around AI. AI is like the 5 paragraph essay. It's an amazing learning tool and an amazing tool to help sharpen a skill that is already there.
Yeah. Right.
But it's not a
Yeah.
substitute for developing that skill.
Yeah. And it's amazing to me how, man, I gotta say how surprised I am to the level of candidness that people talk about how they use chat. And I have a premium chat GPT membership. So I have no problem with the tool, but I very much think of it as a tool. And it's
Mm-hmm.
I was listening to a guy present and he was talking about his I was at the presentation, he was presenting and he said, yeah, I was trying to figure out what to talk about today. So I went to chat GPT and asked, and I think he was doing it as sort of like a tool for like relatability of like, yeah, we've
Yeah.
all been there. But I
Yeah.
also kind of felt myself thinking like, this is a little strange that you went to ChatGPT to figure out what to talk about today. Like, I would
Yeah. I could have done
assume
that.
it's kind of,
I could have done that as opposed to projecting the mentality of, oh, I have something I want to share,
yes.
and Chat GPT can help me
What's
maybe encapsulate it or package
Yeah,
it in a way
what's the
that will
hook?
be most interesting.
Or exactly, like, how do I maybe I'm not, I've I feel like everyone and this is the Bible Belt. Everyone's been to
Mhm,
church on a Sunday where the pastor, like, rambles, and you're like, "Where is this going?" So I understand someone going to ChatGPT to be like, "This is what I care about and what I wanna talk about. Help me organize this." But to
mhm.
your point, it's the tool for what you're trying to deliver on. It's not the substance itself. Um, but whether we're talking about AI or not, I do think it's interesting. You used the word widgets earlier. It almost feels like people are always looking for like what is the latest widget that I can pick up and apply and skip the long-term relationship building phase and just continually like I'm going to apply this widget and get this output. Like how do I get as many outputs
Yeah,
as possible? Which
it's listen, I tell people you can't solve for access.
mm,
Okay, you just can't. And I know that frustrates the hell out of so many people, especially in the startup world, especially in the business world. Social media doesn't make it better. I mean, you just um, need to do the work, and there are ways to like do the work without burning out. There are
mm,
ways to do the work and like still make money. There are ways to do the work and still grow your company. I'm not advocating for like, hey, just go out and live in fantasy land and hope something works out. I'm not advocating for that. But there are certain things that sound that like that people repeat certain like business school gospel um that
This is a real pet peeve of mine, by the way.
that well like okay, I'll give you an example. Say no more than you say yes
Yeah, right.
is a great example of a piece of advice that is usually espoused by people who have tons of opportunities and they
Yeah,
have to be very selective with their time.
yeah,
Okay. I'm not criticizing those people, but like they are in a different position than someone who's still trying to grow and build their network. You
yeah,
know what you should do if you don't have a ton of inbound stuff? You should be going to every event, whether it's online or in person, that
yeah,
makes sense for you mental health wise and
yeah,
financial
yeah.
and time wise. Okay, I'm not advocating for you to burn yourself out. I want to be very clear about that.
No,
But
sure,
if
yeah,
there are a lot of events that are free, there are a lot of events where it's like a $5, you know, cover charge,
yeah.
and what a great place to meet people. What a great place to show up. You know how you build a relationship and build a reputation is by showing up consistently.
Yeah.
And one day, people just realize that you are one of the voices in the room,
Mm,
and they look for you to be at that metaphorical table. And I can't tell people how long it takes. Oh, is it going to take 6 months? I don't know. Is it going to take 12 months? I don't know. It depends on the community. It depends who you are. Depends the kind of content you're talking about. But one thing I know is 100% true, and I can guarantee it, is that if you continually do that, you continually show up, and not just for yourself, not just for your demo day or your sales pitch, show up for other people.
mm,
It's actually better to show up for other people than it is for your own thing because it projects that you're not there just for yourself.
mhm.
And that helps build a reputation that's really good.
Man, Adam, you've said so many things that I've been like, "Oh, I wanna mention," but I'm trying to avoid doing, like, a checklist of, like, "You said this, and you said that," and but even to that last point, one of the networking events I go to every week is it's a Friday and I don't know if this is, like, a more of a local thing. A lot of our local networking events are essentially pitch events. You
Yeah.
go, you pitch your business, the next person goes, what have you. One of the things that I've talked a lot about for our local networking events is that a lot of people put so much value in the pitch. Like you get up, you have your 30 seconds, you have your 60 seconds. How do I say all the right things to, get a buyer? And then when the event ends, whoop, you're gone. You leave. Which, every introvert in the room's like, dear God, I just need to get out of here. I already spoke in front of everyone, like I'm ready to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what I've tried to talk about is, hey, the value of those events is actually it's not the 60-second pitch. It's the time before the meeting and the time after the meeting where you actually are talking to people and to your point, not looking for people to repeat your pitch to, but
Mhm.
people to go up to, "Hey, yeah, so I heard you mention this in your pitch. Like, what tell me more about that. Like, what is that?" And actually developing real shocker of an idea, having a real
Connections, like real
conversation. Yeah,
conversations.
yeah. So
There's so much truth in that. So like, look, the pitch itself is valuable in the context of you are getting up and stretching a muscle that
mm,
um is hard.
yep,
Okay. I think it's a valuable skill to get up and pitch. And I change my pitch every now and again, like every other day. Um, it's a good thing to get up in front of people. Um, let's talk about the introvert extrovert thing. I don't think people are one dimensional.
mm,
I'm not one dimensional.
yeah,
I'm a networking consultant, coach, speaker, whatever, whatever. And like, dude, like I'm still not in the middle of the crowd when I go to events. Like I'm that person on the side with a soda, with a coffee, and like this is when I know a lot of people still. And I
yeah,
just want people to recognize that like you don't need to be Johnny High School, like in the middle of everything. Okay. You're fine. There are ways
yeah,
for you to stretch that muscle and get very comfortable
yeah.
without needing to feel like you have to change yourself.
Well, and it's finding what works for you rather than I take myself out of the game entirely in that,
Yes. Yeah.
I'm just as soon as the event ends, I'm gone. And it's misunderstanding where the value in the event is developed and
Mhm.
misunderstanding that it's the pitch that makes it when really it's not. And
No,
and
it
and this is maybe to my own detriment, but at pitch events like that, I am very, you know, blase. I don't know. I'm like,
yeah.
yeah, this is me. This
Well,
is what I do.
to be
Just
fair, I am too. And like when I go to pitch events where I'm not pitching,
mhm,
I go to a lot here in Atlanta. It's like, oh, I'm interested because I'm learning about other companies. I'm
yeah,
learning about their founders. Um, but the most interesting thing for me is like I want to talk to them. Oh, someone's
yeah,
doing a healthcare startup. Oh, that's kind of cool. My girlfriend's a nurse, so like I
yeah.
have questions. Or someone's doing a legal startup. Well, my sister's in law school.
Do
That's
you
kind of cool.
do you ever think about, because I think of myself as a very intentional person, and I hope people who know me well would agree with that. One of the things that I maybe overthink about on my end is whenever I meet someone for the first time or I'm having a conversation, I really want, disarm's the wrong word, but like I want them to know my questions are intentional. And so here's an example of like a thought process I have. I work with a lot of business owners and especially sometimes new business owners. Well,
Mhm.
someone will come to the networking event and they'll say, "Hey, I'm a brand new business owner." And my heart and my intention is I want to meet that person because I want to encourage them. I wanna
Mhm.
hear, "Hey, how's it going? How's the game going?" Like, "Yeah, this is pretty tough." And just like I said, encourage. I wanna know about the business. "Hey, if I know anyone, I wanna connect you." But
Mhm.
whenever I'm going up to that person, what's in my mind is, "Okay, I wanna really make sure they know I'm not trying to sell them on a service. Oh, you're the new oh, hey, let me sell you on." So, like, and I don't really have
Yeah.
much of a question around that other than just, like, what's either your advice or what comes to mind with being intentional, but also disarming people. And a good example is like on LinkedIn. When I connect with someone on LinkedIn, I almost always these days start with, "I promise I'm not selling you anything." Just
Yeah,
because
I
we're
because
you know,
everyone is
we're
now.
just so accustomed to it, right? It's like a genuine connection. And even
Yeah.
when I invite people on the podcast, I'll say, "Hey, I'd love to have you on the show. Just so you know, this isn't like a sales thing. I'm not going to sell you on anything afterwards. It's just a genuine invitation." But I find myself doing that, disarming more and more because I want them to know it's a genuine the
Yeah,
intention is true.
genuine conversation. I mean, that is something that comes from tonality. It comes from, just really like, when I say being present, I mean, like, when you grow a reputation as being someone people wanna know, that does a lot of that work for you. There
Mm,
are a lot of people who wanna talk to me, um, because, like, I'm not trying to hard sell them on my services. And if someone comes to me and like needs a service that I don't provide, like I don't do logo design. Well, then I'm happy to pass it along to someone who I know who might do logo
mm,
design. And I think that, being intentional, that word gets thrown around so much.
yeah, like
And
authentic.
sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not good,
Yeah,
right? I'd be very intentional with your conversations. Becomes code for don't have a lot of conversations, right?
yeah.
Be very specific. It's
Yeah.
like, hey, man, I will talk to damn near anybody. Okay, not in a obnoxious way, but like,
Oh,
like I'll
sure.
talk to someone like I'll talk to the waiter who's bringing me food. I'll
Yeah,
talk to the person who I'm standing next to in line at Starbucks. Like,
yeah,
because if you get into a conversation like that, it becomes, oh, hey, kind of cool, like let's connect and you don't know who you don't know. And so people restrict themselves from having conversations for reasons that I don't really understand.
mm,
I think the reasons are like, is this my ideal customer? Well, I mean, frankly, how do you know unless you have the conversation? Someone may even appear to be your ideal customer. And then, two conversations in, you may say, wow, gee, I don't know. Like, I don't know if I vibe with this person or I don't vibe with how they do business. It's just not a good fit for me.
yeah,
Even though on the front end, it looks like the ideal customer. Like, you just don't
right,
know.
right.
And this is why I say building networks is not the same as exclusively building a customer base.
Mm.
This material is not about trying to double your sales, although it probably will help you do that.
Oh,
It's about,
I think it
yeah.
absolutely will. I
Oh, I
mean,
absolutely think it will, but it's about,
100%. I mean, but this is like my total bias in that I mean, everything you're saying, I'm like drinking from, a fires of like, yes, yes, that
yeah.
just
Well,
having
I
done
mean,
business for so many years, I'm like, this is the recipe for more revenue for sure.
well, and for more opportunities. So I'll give you an example, and I'll use South by as an example as a really bird's eye view. So I don't want to, whatever. But when I went to, I only applied to South by Southwest 24 because applications are like 6 months prior. And I only applied because I had a friend of mine who said, "Hey, you should apply and maybe do a mentorship thing." And like, hey, all right, cool. Like it wasn't I didn't have any special treatment. It was I hadn't really considered it. It was very daunting and I was surprised, frankly, and grateful that I got in and was able to have a really wonderful experience. And after the experience, after I did the mentorship couple hours that was agreed upon, I went to, I say my contact. I don't mean my personal contact. I mean the person who was, facilitating, like, hey, if you have any questions, and basically answered my really basic questions like, hey, what's the security protocol? And do I need to bring my computer? And just like all the really basic stuff that you want to know. I emailed the person and I was like, hey, if you're still in town, I'm in town for another day or two. Like, I'd love to come down to wherever you are and just like say thank you in person because this was daunting. It was a new experience for me. And, I appreciate all the work that goes into the back end of a conference and an event, no matter how big it is, although South by is very big. And just to say thank you and express gratitude. And
Mm,
from that conversation, the person asked me like, well, have you considered possibly applying for a workshop? And it wasn't like, oh, here's a special code or here's a special this. It just was like, hey,
yeah,
I think that this was a fun conversation that we had.
yeah,
It might be of interest to the judging committee, maybe not, who knows? And maybe it's something you want to apply for.
yeah.
Not anything that is like, oh, and now I have an in or anything like that. You still go through the same process, you still go through the same protocols as everyone else, but just the conversation leading to, oh, gee, I hadn't really considered that. Or it seemed out of reach because it seemed daunting.
Mhm.
And suddenly it doesn't seem so daunting just based on a conversation around gratitude and saying thank you for helping me in this experience.
It reminds me
And
of oh, sorry, go ahead.
well, I was gonna say, and I just want people to understand that like expressing gratitude is a networking superpower.
Mm,
It's not like, oh, I said thank you, now I should get free stuff or special
yeah,
treat.
yeah,
It's saying thank you and someone in their mind saying, "Oh, this is a nice person. It would be great if they applied for this opportunity and we'll see
yeah.
what happens."
Well,
You know?
and I think and this might just be my bias. I mean, I don't know if people in general act this way, but for me, I feel like I am actively trying to activate the altruistic side of gratitude on my end, like saying thank you just to show gratitude
Mm,
while deactivating or dehabitualizing the expectation of reciprocity. Because
right.
I find myself in conversations with people on this where they're like, "Hey, I sent a thank you card to them and they didn't say anything back to me." Like,
Okay.
from like a sales perspective, and I'm like, "Well, you didn't send the thank you card so that it would lead to the next deal. You sent the thank you card to say thank you." And like, I mean, I had a competitor of mine who's great guy. It was his birthday. He had been posting on Facebook all week about how it was his birthday. So I sent him a cake for his birthday. I didn't hear a word from this guy. And I could be mad. Wow, what's his problem? How come he didn't? I was thinking it was going to lead to bit. None of that entered my mind at all. It was, I sent the cake because I wanted to, because I just wanted to be kind, and that's not, I mean, people listening, it's a $15 cake. So I'm not like patting myself on the back about it. It wasn't like, a wedding
It
cake,
was a
but
Kroger cake. It was.
yeah, let's just be real. It's not like, I'm not being ridiculous about it, but I'm just saying, it's interesting how much as business people, it feels like we're often, again, it's inputs and outputs. I'm going to input this act of whatever it is, and there's this expectation of output. And it almost feels like doing this the right way is decoupling those things. And more
Yes.
importantly, just understanding it kind of is what goes around comes around. And that the more you do this, the
Mhm.
more, like you said, it's not a straight up and to the right. It's like the sea level rises a little bit more.
A little bit each time, and
Yeah.
that's why I was so careful to word that example about the South by Southwest opportunities, because it would be so easy for someone to come away from that with like, oh, this is the way you do it. This is the hack.
Yeah.
It's like, no, it was an opportunity that I applied for the same way everyone else does. No
Mhm.
special treatment. But I hadn't considered that as a possibility until having the conversation with someone and going, huh, that's kind of interesting. So you learn things about yourself just from having conversations, which come from expressing gratitude. Because what you're really doing is you are really telegraphing, look, this isn't just about me.
Mhm.
I understand there's a lot of work that goes into these conferences. There's a lot of thankless work that happens behind the scenes. And when you are able to maintain and scale big networks of people, a lot of that happens from communicating to them that you want them in your network for reasons other than like what their bank account might be or what their current title might be. It's like I want that person in my network, whether they stay at that company or move on to another company, because
Right.
that person will say, "Oh, hey, look, I heard about this cool opportunity. Here's the sign up link or here's the
Yeah.
application link. And I thought of you," because they're going to push you to do really cool, better things
Yep.
and grow. And that's what comes out of it, not like having a hack for
Yeah.
any particular organization.
You know what I think of is I was sitting down with a guy who runs a very large agency, and he was very kind with his time of just like, hey, let's get together, let's just swap notes. Um, this guy's agency is incredibly successful, average customer 50, 60, $70,000,
Mhm,
which about 5 times higher than my average customer, maybe around 10K.
mhm.
So the impression I got from, and he didn't present it this way, but the impression I got was, or I was telling myself was, okay, I have a very limited time with this person to ask advice essentially. And so I was trying to think about like, what do I want to ask? And so he said, yeah. So like, how can I help? What do you want to know? And I said, hey, tell me about your lead gen. Like, what are you doing for growing your business? And he
Mhm.
said, well, I mean, it's who you know. And I think sometimes when we hear that expression, we think of it as like a silver spoon,
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
like, oh, I have this incredible, it just naturally was there. And I think where we miss it is not understanding what you're talking about is as we develop these networks and we really invest in other people, and also I would add, invest without expecting anything back, which I think is an important caveat. It does seem like you find yourself saying like, wow, yeah, customers just come to me. People just come to me, or I get referrals, and it is kind of who but I was willing to create the network to be able to say that. And I think a lot of people just sort of expect it to happen when it just doesn't work that way.
They want it to happen really quickly, and like, look, I'll just say things the way they are. Like, I know a lot of people here in Atlanta, in the tech scene, in the startup scene, the business community, who are people whom I would consider movers and shakers, extremely well connected, in some ways extremely powerful. Certainly, a lot of them are very financially successful. And like, did I just walk into a room, one single networking event or two networking events, and suddenly now we know each other? No, of course not. It was years of
Mhm.
showing up at events consistently. Some events they were at that event, sometimes they were at that event, and just consistently being in a community and across different networks and communities. Um, and showing up in a way that is consistent in my, when I say my brand, I mean looking for ways to help other people, looking for ways to connect other people, looking for ways to be a positive force. And now I have access to a lot of those people. Does that automatically mean I get funding? Of course not. I said I'd have to raise just like everyone else.
Yeah.
Does it mean I automatically have, 300K in my bank account every 2 weeks? Of course not. Okay.
Though that would be nice.
That would be nice. I mean, well, we can still dream here. But the
Yeah.
point is that what I want people to understand is I know how to get access to people.
Yeah.
Getting access and maintaining access is it changes the game. It means all the energy that people expend stressing over, how do I get access to this investor? How do I get access to PR or journalism or this collaborator or this person who runs a company who would be great to partner with? All that effectively goes away because you understand how to think through the mental gymnastics. And it is mental gymnastics. It does
Mhm.
take time to think through. It's almost like a legal strategy. What happens on the page and gets filed with the court is not what you're thinking through an argument. You're thinking through a set of chess moves, and like maybe that makes it sound daunting to people. But when you understand how to do it, it's like anything else. You understand how to go about the process. And one of the things that I find myself so consistently baffled by is networking as a concept seems like something that people relegate to, like, oh, it's for startups, it's for people starting out because they don't know anyone, they don't have any customers, they don't have any collaborators. And it's like, well, yes, those people um, should be building their networks. I'm 100% behind that. But you know who should also be building their networks and investing in it? Mid to large size corporations. You know why? Because those people have something that startups don't have. They have two things, actually. They usually have more revenue, okay, more budget to put into it, and they have people.
Mm.
They have an army of boots on the ground who can go out and evangelize their product, not just their product, their organization, and really open up lots of conversations because they frankly have more people. So if you're a company that is, 100 people, think about what you have
Yeah.
that you can invest in, that your competitor who's a startup, they don't have access to the human capital in the same way. And so when large organizations feel like, oh, we don't need to network, we have access to money, we have access to sales, we have access to funding. It's like, well, you have access to a lot of the good things. Are you continually scaling and maintaining that network in the most efficient way? Why would you not be investing in
Mm.
something that you can be? That's a big moat,
Well,
you know?
and it
Yeah.
it's wild to me. I see some corporations do this really well, where like they're everywhere. And then I've seen
Mhm.
some that try to get into this and they're still stuck in the input output
Yes.
dichotomy of like
Yes.
it's either profitable or it's not. And so they're like going through each event and like ticking a box of, did it bring me money? Did it bring me a sale? Which and again, I love that you've mentioned this a few times of like almost getting out of the black and whiteness of decision making of like, is this a good decision or a bad decision? And instead understanding the nuance of like, no, it didn't bring me a sale, but it led to like these three relationships that are really great or
Mhm.
that, what have you.
Mhm.
But on the same time, I do appreciate that people have a bit of a strategic, because I guess the other side of it would be like, I met this, this poor woman, we were having a conversation of her business and she was like, "Yeah, I have around 60 meetings a week." And I said, "Okay. So like where's that like how's that going?" And she was like, "I am losing my mind. Like I'm exhausted." Cuz
I imagine so. I
and
mean,
and and for her though, she probably could have used a little bit more of that strategic thinking around, okay, I really only have the capacity for 20 meetings. So, how do I make sure that I am as intentional as possible with those 20 people rather than going so wide and exhausting myself?
Here's I'll just break it down for people because I know there must be some listeners who are like, this is all great in theory, but like I'm not hearing any numbers. So like, let me break it down. I have been in the room with billions of dollars. Okay. I'm not gonna say who and I'm not gonna say where, but I'm gonna say it like that because people just respond to that word. Okay. So I've been in the room with people who have some serious financial edge. 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, coming out of COVID, we're in 2025 now. So I started doing this kind of networking, this kind of stuff, separate from like I was in personal branding for a while. I think we kind of talked about that before. I was in the music industry for a long time. Okay, so like let's say end of 2021. Okay, maybe Q4 of 2021 into 2022 is when I started shifting into this real networking, relationship building, access scaling kind of mentality. In 2022, I'd say 70 to 80% of people, maybe 85% of people who I spoke to didn't get it. There was a 20 or 25% who did, and they know who they are and they've been amazing supporters all this time. But like it's not like people didn't get it because they're dumb. They're not. People are smart, but like they didn't see how it was different than the sales and marketing structure. And now I can tell you 2.5, 3 years later, that number has reversed, where it's
Mm,
80%, 85% of people who I when I say couldn't get in front of, I don't mean in person. I mean like couldn't get an email.
mhm.
Okay. Couldn't get a response on a LinkedIn comment. Okay. Those organizations, I'm now in discussions with a number of those organizations. Okay. And that is time and patience. I said this on the last podcast. This is a war of attrition.
Mm.
Okay. It's between you and your impatience and the people who say, oh, I did this for 3 weeks and it didn't work. You know why? Because you did it for 3 weeks. You know why it's worked for me? You know why I can talk
Yeah.
my way into any room? Because I know how to do it.
Yeah.
And it takes time to develop that skill the way it would take time to develop any other skill. But what I think is so critical for companies to recognize is we are now in the same place that we were in 2013, 14 vis-a-vis social media management. And what I mean by that is when I was kind of coming out of college, 2013, 14, 15, that time period, the concept that you would pay somebody or a boutique firm to do like, oh, they're going to post on LinkedIn for you and you're going to
Yeah.
pay them or
Oh,
you're going to
yeah.
post on Twitter or
Yeah.
YouTube, like it
I
just sounds so bizarre.
Well, I remember the exact same time frame, like around 2013. I had just moved back to Arkansas and I ran into an old friend and said, "What do you do now?" She said, "Oh, I'm a social media like marketing manager or social media
Mhm.
manager." And I literally and back then, if you remember, social media as a term didn't really become a thing until maybe like 2010-ish. We just
Yeah.
didn't talk about it, colloquially like that.
The Facebook movie. It was the Facebook movie.
Yeah, yeah, that's right, actually. And so she was like, "Oh, I'm a social media manager." And I was like, "Oh,
Oh,
so
okay.
what? Like, what is that?"
Right.
And I teased her about it, and now I look like, the
Yeah,
jackass
yeah.
years
Now,
later. It's like, "Oh,
and
well."
so where social media management was in 2014, kind of like on that cusp of like people who got into it early are the same people who are like getting into AI in the last year and a half. Like they understand where the AI, the no code stuff, like all these are trends, right? So I have a friend who was into the no code stuff a couple years ago, and he's doing gangbusters now, and like that's awesome. Couple of friends actually, not just one. And the reason I bring those examples up is that is where network building, relationship building is now. So companies, corporate companies, startup companies, universities, you go right down the line. The ones who invest in it now for their community, whether it's a student body or a workforce, an employee pool, who show that community how to build relationships and open up lots of doors and dialogues for their organization or their university, whatever it is, those are going to be the people who are ahead of the pack in 5 years, because AI has watered down so much of the way that people think they're supposed to be reaching out to others, that the people who will stand out are the ones who know how to scale and maintain relationships and conversations over the long term. To me, like, it's so obvious.
Mm-hmm.
And if I were a company, whether I'm a startup, I have 4 employees, or I'm a public company, I would be tripping over myself to invest money in this, because it will put my organization ahead of the pack in a 3 to 5 year window. And I mean, I just don't know how to make it simpler than that.
Well, you heard them, folks. You can't sit on your laurels with this kind of stuff. I mean, there's some real opportunity, and I'd say even take it from those of us who've been in business for a long time, who've actually seen the fruit of this pay off. It does pay off. There is a payoff, not just revenue wise, but in terms of just the fullness of your relationships. Adam, we're way over time. I couldn't stop myself from this stuff. So this is just great stuff to talk about. People listening, you have your website, 0to1networker.com. Networking, 0 to 1 networking, 0 to 1
No,
networking.
you got it right.
Yeah,
Zero
yeah.
to one networker.com.
It's like one of those moments where you're talking to someone, and I don't know if you ever find yourself in a situation where you're like, yeah, thanks, Adam. And then you have like this crisis in your head of like, oh God, is their name Adam? Wait, what's their name? You know, it's like, of course, it's like, we've known each other for 10 years, you know, but anyway, so we have the website. Is that the best way for someone to connect with you? What do you prefer for someone who wants to follow your content or connect?
I'm pretty. I used to be on Twitter a whole lot. I'm never calling it X. Admittedly, especially in the last year, I've pretty much wound down there. Frankly, candidly, I just can't take the anti-Semitism. There it is. And so you can send me a DM on Twitter, but you are better finding me on LinkedIn. I'm all over LinkedIn. Look for the orange sunglasses. So you can drop me a message there. You can leave a comment. You can go to the 0 to 1 Networker. Also has a LinkedIn page. Also, I think I'm on Instagram if you're on Instagram. Or you could drop an email at 0 to 1 Networker, adam@0to1networker.com. Gosh, that was a lot of the same words all over.
No, it's great.
Yeah. But I really, really encourage people to start to invest in this and like make it a part of your budget in addition to your sales and marketing, because it will supercharge that.
Yeah.
And so anyone who wants to reach out can just be like, hey, I heard you on Blake's podcast, and go right to the top of the list.
Adam, thanks so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, man, we clearly have to do another.
Oh yeah, we'll have a round.
We have
three.
So much to talk about.
Yeah,
but
we'll have a round 3.
We'll have a round 3. Thank you for having me, and I wish everyone well.
Hey, for our listeners, if you're a first-time listener to the podcast, what the heck are you waiting on? Click the subscribe or follow button so I can keep bringing you good advice wherever you are in your business. Of course, I do appreciate those of you who support the podcast. You can always support the podcast on our Patreon, patreon.com/goodadvice. Or if you're a business, you want to sponsor a podcast episode, you can always reach out, Blake@goodadvicecoaching.com. All of Adam's info I'm going to have in the episode description, so you can keep track of how to best reach out to him. And reach out to him, you should, because he'd be a great person to add to your network as well. Hey, that's today's good advice. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you later. See ya.